It's tough to pinpoint exactly when things started to fall apart between Lacey and me. I mean, we'd had our ups and downs like any couple, but this was something different. There was a time when we felt unbreakable, like nothing could come between us. But then little by little, things began to shift. You know, everyone assumes that once you get married, everything will just work out. That commitment somehow smooths over the cracks. And for a while, it felt like that for us too. But over the years, our talks got shorter, colder. Everything we said to each other started feeling more like formalities, like we were checking off some list. The topic of kids hung between us like a ghost we were both trying to avoid, but somehow, every argument we had eventually circled back to it. Maybe we thought we'd get around to it someday, but honestly, the way things were going, it just felt like a matter of time before we'd stop talking entirely. And then there were the late nights. She started spending a lot more time outside of home, sometimes for work, sometimes meeting up with friends. It's not that I wanted to be controlling or anything, but it was hard not to notice how often she'd come home later than she said. At first, I didn't think too much about it. I mean, I trusted her. But it's the little things that stick out, you know? I'd catch her on her phone more often, and when I'd ask, it was always work. It got to the point where, even at dinner, she'd be glued to that thing, claiming there were urgent messages. But something didn't feel right. And I'd always heard that if you get a gut feeling about something, it's probably worth listening to. So, I did. There were these other signs, too. Out of the blue, new clothes that I knew we didn't have the money for. And then there were the late nights when she'd come home and slip into bed without even bothering to explain why she was so late. I couldn't remember the last time she hugged me without it feeling forced, like it was more out of habit than any real affection. I started to get the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was someone else in her life. One night, she was out again, supposedly with friends. She told me not to wait up, so I decided to text her. Nothing serious, just a hey, hope you're having fun kind of thing. But an hour went by, and she didn't reply. Another hour after that, still nothing. I texted her again, thinking maybe her phone was on silent or something, but still nothing. I stayed up until she finally walked through the door, around 1 in the morning, looking completely unfazed. I asked her if she'd seen my texts, and she shrugged. Oh, I must not have heard it. Right? Didn't hear it. For 3 hours? Come on. On top of all this, work wasn't going well either. My boss had been hinting at downsizing, and it was pretty clear that I was on the chopping block if I didn't start showing some improvement. Pressure was mounting from every side. Lacey's distance, the constant risk of losing my job, and I felt cornered, like I was in some twisted game where every move was rigged against me. Coming home didn't even feel like a relief anymore. It just reminded me of how alone I was starting to feel. One night, I realized I couldn't keep all of this to myself anymore. I needed an outside perspective, someone who could look at this mess with clear eyes. So, I decided to talk to Lewis, an old friend of mine who'd gone into private investigation. We met up at this little cafe we used to hit back in the day, and I laid everything out for him. He listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, and when I was finished, he gave me this look that was somewhere between pity and concern. Look, he said, I'm not going to tell you to jump to conclusions, but if you really think something's going on, then you need to be sure before you do anything drastic. He told me to start paying attention to the little things, the time she went out, who she was with, what she was doing on her phone. If there's something there, it'll reveal itself. But don't go in guns blazing without proof. And as much as I hated to admit it, he was right. I couldn't just confront Lacey on a feeling. I needed something concrete. So I started watching, not stalking or anything crazy like that, just paying closer attention. The way she held her phone close whenever I was around, the long pauses before she answered questions about her day, how quick she was to brush off anything that went a little too deep. I'd start to bring up some old memory, a trip we'd taken together, a night we'd spent talking about the future, and she'd just changed the subject. Around this time, things with my stepbrother Ricardo got heated too. We'd both been dealing with our dad's estate since he passed, and every time we met, it turned into a wrestling match. Ricardo had this attitude, like he deserved everything just because he was the oldest, and I was just there to fill a seat. He kept throwing in my face how he was the real heir, how he deserved more because he'd worked harder. The guy had no respect. To top it all off, I knew something about him that his wife, Ellen, didn't. I'd seen him out at a bar with another woman not too long ago, cozy as can be, hands everywhere they shouldn't be. I never told Ellen. I figured if I ever needed to use it, I'd keep it in my back pocket. But now, with Lacey acting strange and the pressure from work, Ricardo's crap was the last thing I needed. But here's the thing. All of this was just building up like this storm was coming, and I couldn't see a way out. I couldn't tell if I was overthinking or if everything really was falling apart around me. I'll never forget that night. Lacey came home, so late it was almost morning. She stumbled through the door, hair all over the place, makeup smeared, her clothes wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them, or worse. The smell hit me first, a mix of stale booze and some unfamiliar perfume. Thick and heady, the kind I knew wasn't hers. And she had the nerve to walk right past me without a word, mumbling something about too many drinks before collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. She'd left her phone on the table, just lying there in plain sight. I'd never wanted to invade her privacy before, even with all the suspicion building inside me. But in that moment, I couldn't help myself. The pieces of the puzzle were right in front of me, and for the first time, I felt like maybe I'd find some answers to all those lingering questions. I picked it up, hands shaking a bit, and unlocked it. Sure enough, the screen opened right to her messages, and there it was, proof staring me in the face. I scrolled through the recent messages, and my heart stopped when I saw her colleague's name, Trevor. The conversation was casual at first, just work stuff and stupid little jokes, but as I went further back, it became obvious. The guy was calling her babe and sending her texts at all hours. My stomach churned as I opened a photo she'd sent him. Nothing too revealing at first, just a selfie. But then came the semi-nude shots, her bare shoulders, the look in her eyes. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to keep going. And then I found it, a message from Trevor from earlier that night, right after she'd left that so-called corporate party. His words hit me like a slap. Last night was mind-blowing. Can't wait for a repeat. I don't remember how long I stood there, just staring at the screen, the weight of betrayal settling over me. My mind was buzzing, 100 thoughts colliding at once, but above all, there was this searing pain in my chest, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. When she finally woke up the next morning, still hungover and completely oblivious, I had to force myself not to confront her right then and there. She had the nerve to give me a half smile, mumbling something about being tired from networking. I could barely look at her, so I muttered something about needing fresh air and went outside, dialing Lewis's number before I could think twice. Lewis listened without interrupting, letting me spill everything. When I told him about the texts, the pictures, Trevor's disgusting messages, he paused. "Look, man," he said finally, "you've got options. You could record conversations, get more evidence, or you could go public with it. People should know what she's doing." But for some reason, I didn't want to act impulsively, at least not yet. I told him I'd wait. There was still the issue of the inheritance, and I needed that wrapped up before I made any big moves. I wanted to be in control, not rushing in like some hot-headed fool. For the next few days, I avoided Lacey as much as possible. Anytime she was home, I'd make excuses, throw myself into work, even put in some overtime, anything to keep myself out of the house. It wasn't just to avoid her. I needed to cool down, to think straight without her around, to figure out what I was going to do. My boss even noticed my renewed productivity, something he'd been on my case about for weeks. For once, it felt like I had a grip on at least one part of my life. In the meantime, Ricardo was still being a pain. The inheritance talks dragged on. Every meeting an endless argument. He wanted it all. Kept saying he deserved more, like he'd somehow earned it. He didn't know I was sitting on a little secret of my own, one that could blow up his perfect little world if I felt like it. After one last exhausting negotiation, we finally settled on an agreement. I signed the papers, shook his hand, and felt an odd sense of relief. The inheritance was finalized. Now, I could finally focus on the revenge I'd been planning in the back of my mind. I told Ricardo I'd drop by his place sometime soon, maybe for a drink, just to keep up the appearance that we were still on civil terms. But that wasn't my plan. Not even close. The next day, when I knew he'd be at work, I drove over to his house. When I pulled up to Ricardo's house, I wasn't sure what to expect. Ellen opened the door, And even though she tried to give me a warm smile, I could see the sadness in her eyes, the fatigue in her face. She looked like someone who hadn't truly smiled in a long time. We settled into her living room, the silence stretching as we each wrestled with our own thoughts. After a few minutes, she broke the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. She admitted she'd been suspecting Ricardo for a while now, that he'd been slipping out with flimsy excuses, work late, last-minute meetings, that sort of thing. I could hear the ache in her voice as she spoke, her gaze distant, avoiding eye contact. Her voice trembled as she said, "It doesn't even try to hide it anymore, you know? Just acts like I'm invisible." I could relate, maybe more than she knew. For the first time since everything had fallen apart with Lacey, I felt compelled to be honest. I took a deep breath and told Ellen what I knew, that I'd seen Ricardo with another woman, laughing and carrying on without a single thought of her. When I looked up, she was staring down, her hands clenched together tightly. Silent tears streaked down her cheeks, and I could see the years of disappointment written all over her face. I feel so empty," she whispered, wiping her face. "I don't feel like I'm anything to him. He doesn't even pretend to care anymore." Her voice was shaky, like she was fighting to hold herself together. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both sharing in some twisted, parallel tragedy. We'd both been cast aside, treated like we didn't matter. After a while, I suggested we go out for a drink. It felt too heavy, sitting there in that room, filled with memories and heartbreak. She agreed, and we found a small, quiet bar nearby. It was the kind of place where you could talk without worrying about anyone eavesdropping, dimly lit and empty save for a few regulars. We sat across from each other, and as we ordered our drinks, it felt like a weight was lifting. Every sip seemed to loosen something inside her, and she began opening up in ways I hadn't expected. She told me about her marriage, the disappointment and hurt, how she felt like she'd lost herself trying to be the wife Ricardo expected, only to be tossed aside. She spoke in broken sentences, each one laced with years of bottled-up frustration, and all I could do was listen and nod because her words were hitting way too close to home. After a few rounds, I felt like I couldn't hold back anymore either. I told her about Lacey, how she'd shattered every bit of trust I'd put in her, how I devoted everything to a marriage that was clearly just a game to her. I found photos, messages. I said, my voice quieter than I intended, with some guy from her work. It's like the years we had together meant nothing. Ellen looked at me, her eyes soft, but full of understanding. For a moment, we just sat there, both drowning in our own betrayal, our own loneliness. And then something shifted. We weren't just two hurt people anymore. We were connected in a way that only shared pain can create. There was a raw honesty between us, like we didn't need to put on a front, didn't need to pretend to be okay. The barrier between us crumbled. We left the bar and found ourselves at a nearby hotel. When we got to the room, Ellen looked at me, and there was something in her gaze, trust, maybe, or just the need to feel wanted again. I reached out, touched her shoulder, and she shivered, but not from cold. Her eyes closed, and I saw the weight lift from her face as she leaned into me. And suddenly, there was no hesitation. There was no guilt, no second-guessing. We were both pouring out years of loneliness and frustration, clinging to each other like we'd found the only other person who understood what it felt like to be betrayed and discarded. The night passed in a blur of whispered words, quiet laughter, and moments of unspoken understanding. Her touch was tender but desperate, and we lost ourselves completely. By the time morning came, I felt different, lighter. There was a strange kind of peace, a calm that I hadn't felt in years. And as I looked over at Ellen lying next to me, her expression soft and relieved, I knew I wasn't alone in that. She looked at me with a steely determination. "I'm done with him, Dexter. I'm done with all of this. I'm filing for divorce. He's not getting another chance." There was no doubt in her voice, no lingering pain, just finality. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but something inside me snapped. I took out my phone, found the photos of Lacey and Trevor I'd saved, and sent them to every contact she had, friends, family, coworkers. I added a short message, letting them know exactly who she was and what I was leaving her for. As I hit send, I felt a rush of relief, like I was finally taking control of my own life. The weight was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The drive home that morning felt surreal. The gravity of what I'd done hadn't fully hit me yet. Sure, I felt free. There was no denying that. I'd been carrying the weight of betrayal for so long that finally letting go was like shedding a layer of skin. But the reality of it all, the aftermath that I knew was coming, lingered like a storm on the horizon. Part of me couldn't believe I'd actually gone through with it, sending those photos out for everyone to see. Yet another part of me, the part that had been so beaten down and betrayed, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing the minute I got home. I ignored it at first, but it didn't take a genius to figure out who was on the other end. The calls, the texts, the notifications lighting up my screen. Lacey had seen the photos. I could only imagine the chaos it had caused. The shock as she realized her dirty little secret wasn't so secret anymore. She'd built her life on a web of lies, and with one press of a button, I'd torn it all down. An hour later, the door flew open, and there she was, her face red and tear-streaked, her eyes wild with a mix of fury and panic. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, breathing heavily, fists clenched at her sides. Then, as if a dam had burst, she started yelling, accusations, excuses, trying to twist her actions, as though she were the victim. "You had no right," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You don't understand what I was going through. You pushed me to this." Her words hit me like empty echoes. The anger, the tears, it was all an act, I realized. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was only sorry she'd been caught. I felt nothing as I looked at her, just an overwhelming sense of calm that settled deeper as her rage grew. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to engage. I let her ramble, let her excuses trip over themselves, and just watched her. The more I stayed silent, the more frantic she became, and I could see the realization starting to sink in. She was losing this fight. Finally, I spoke. My voice was steady, colder than I'd ever heard it. "It's over between us, Lacey." She froze, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a second, I saw a flicker of vulnerability there, a moment where she seemed to understand that this was it. But then, she slipped back into her act, pleading, begging for forgiveness, dredging up memories of our years together, trying to remind me of all the good times we'd shared. She wanted me to feel pity, to see her as the woman I once loved. But that woman was gone, and I couldn't force myself to feel anything for the stranger standing in front of me. "We have a history, Dexter. You can't just throw it all away," she said, her voice a desperate whisper now. "I know I made a mistake, but doesn't that mean anything to you?" "History?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping. "Our history ended the minute you decided to betray me. You destroyed whatever we had, Lacey. I'm filing for divorce. And this time I mean it." Her expression crumbled. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, a realization that she was losing control of everything. Her career, her reputation, our marriage. It was all slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She looked at me, and I could see the desperation, the helplessness, the dawning understanding that she'd pushed too far. This wasn't just another fight that would blow over. I'd expected to feel something watching her break down, maybe a twisted sense of satisfaction or justice. But there was nothing, just a hollow calm, like a weight that had been pressing on my chest for years had finally lifted. She was nothing to me now, just a shadow of the person I thought I knew. Over the next few days, I heard from mutual friends, saw messages from colleagues she'd reached out to, all of them trying to piece together what had happened. She was on damage control, scrambling to salvage what was left of her reputation. I could picture the conversations, her voice trembling, pleading for sympathy, trying to convince everyone that she was the victim, that I was somehow to blame. But the photos I'd sent had spoken louder than any excuse she could offer, and I knew that people were seeing through her. The calls from Lacey became less frequent, and soon the messages stopped altogether. I knew she was out there trying to repair her image, but I didn't care. Let her talk. Let her plead. It was too late. I was done. In the meantime, I began the real work of moving on. I hired a lawyer, gathering every bit of evidence I had with Lewis's help. Divorce papers were next, and this time, I was committed to following through. There would be no second chances, no going back. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking away from the wreckage of my past, free to finally start living again. I knew the divorce wouldn't be easy, but I hadn't prepared myself for just how ruthless Lacey would get. She hired a high-powered lawyer, the type who looked at me like I was just another opponent he'd steamroll over. I'd expected some resistance, but what she was going for felt like outright war. She wasn't just asking for a fair split. She wanted everything: the house, my savings, a chunk of my retirement. It was as if she thought she deserved compensation for putting up with me, completely ignoring the fact that she'd been the one sneaking around with Trevor behind my back. I was angry, furious, even. She and her lawyer twisted every part of our life together to make me look like the distant, inattentive husband, the one who drove her to look elsewhere. She'd tell the court how I was always too busy, too focused on work, barely there for her, like I hadn't been busting my ass to keep us comfortable. It was the lies that stung the most, hearing her twist things to cover up her own mistakes, pretending I'd ignored her, left her no choice. In reality, I'd been the only one in that marriage holding things together. But I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. My lawyer came prepared, thanks to all the evidence I'd gathered with Lewis's help. In every hearing, we brought out text after text, photo after photo. We made it clear who had broken the vows and where the blame lay. I remember the look on her face each time we produced a new piece of evidence, a mixture of shock and indignation, as if she couldn't believe I'd actually found a way to expose her. At one point, she tried to make it sound like the cheating was a minor mistake, like I should just let it go. But my lawyer's questions cornered her, making her admit to things she'd tried so hard to hide. The judge wasn't sympathetic either. Every time she tried to deflect, they brought her back to the evidence, the texts, the photos. Watching her squirm wasn't as satisfying as I'd expected. It felt strange, empty. She wasn't the woman I'd married, the woman I believed in all those years. She was a stranger now, someone who was only looking out for herself. When we weren't in court, I was messaging Ellen. I'd text her after each session, venting about the absurdity of it all, the lies, the accusations, the desperate moves Lacey was making to paint me as the villain. Ellen would respond with her own stories, telling me about Ricardo's half-baked excuses, his constant demands for their house, his attempts to undermine her claims. It was strange how comforting it felt to talk to her, knowing she was fighting a similar battle. We'd both been blindsided by the people we'd trusted most, and there was a kind of solace in sharing that pain. In some ways, our conversations were more honest than any I'd ever had with Lacey. There was no need to hide, no pretense. We talk about the hurt, the betrayal, the struggle to let go of the life we thought we had. Though we hadn't been intimate since that night, our bond felt even deeper now. It was like we were tethered together by shared wounds, healing side by side. Ellen was clear that she wanted to take things slow, and I agreed. We both needed time to find ourselves again, to heal before anything else. On the toughest days, when it felt like the divorce was just dragging me through the mud, I'd hit the gym. I started going almost every day, more to escape than anything else at first. But soon, it became a ritual. I'd run until my legs felt like they'd give out, lift weights until my arms felt numb. I was pouring out all the anger, all the frustration, channeling it into every rep, every mile. After a few weeks, I met Jeremy. He was one of the regulars, a tall, wiry guy with this easygoing vibe. At first, it was just nods and quick hellos. But as I kept showing up, he'd start chatting with me, asking about my workouts, offering tips. He had this energy that I couldn't ignore, this infectious way of seeing life like every challenge was just another way to grow. Eventually, we started talking more. He told me about his own ups and downs, how he'd gone through his own divorce a few years back. "It's brutal, man, but it gets better," he'd say, handing me a towel after an intense session. "One day, you'll look back and wonder why you stayed so long." Jeremy's optimism was almost unnerving at first, but it wore off on me. He'd been in the dark place I was in now, but he'd come out the other side, happier, focused. His life didn't revolve around his ex anymore, and that gave me hope. We'd talk about the future, about things we wanted to do. He encouraged me to think beyond the divorce, beyond Lacey, to imagine a life where I wasn't defined by this pain. The day the final divorce papers arrived, I sat at my kitchen table and just stared at them for a long time. It wasn't joy I felt, nor triumph. It was something quieter, something like relief. I'd been shackled to so much anger, disappointment, and resentment for so long that feeling free of it was almost foreign. But here it was, the proof that I was finally free. No more court dates, no more accusations, no more arguments. I could finally close the book on that chapter of my life. With the divorce behind me, the future was mine to define. I could make my own choices without considering anyone else's mistakes or lies. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my life, like I could live for myself without the weight of betrayal dragging me down. Lacey tried to reach out a few times after the dust settled. She left messages, asking if we could talk, or if I could give her another chance. The first time I listened to her pleading, a tiny part of me felt something. Maybe pity, maybe a spark of the old attachment we'd once had. But I knew it was just a shadow of what we'd been. I'd put everything into that marriage, and she'd thrown it away. I called her once to be clear, explaining that our paths had diverged. We were done, and it was time to move on. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd left behind more than just Lacey. I'd left behind a part of myself that I no longer wanted or needed. After that, I was free to focus on the things I'd pushed aside for years. There was one dream that had been sitting in the back of my mind, something I'd always thought about but never had the time or energy to pursue: starting my own business. I'd spent years working for other people, answering to bosses who didn't appreciate my efforts. But now, with no one to answer to, I decided to take the plunge. Starting the business was tough, but every moment felt worth it. I poured every ounce of energy, every resource I had, into building it from the ground up. Each step was a reminder that I was creating something of my own, something meaningful. Watching it take shape, seeing clients respond, watching the numbers slowly climb, it was a feeling like no other. There were days I'd stay up late working on the smallest details, tweaking plans, checking progress. It wasn't just a business. It was a reflection of the new life I was building for myself, the life I'd chosen. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with Ellen. Our connection had settled into something supportive, a friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. She was moving on too, finding her own strength and rebuilding her life in ways she hadn't thought possible. She'd occasionally ask about my progress with the business, and I'd check in on her journey, the small victories she celebrated as she grew more confident in herself. We both understood that our shared pain had been part of the healing process, but it wasn't something we'd let define us forever. Our friendship was a reminder of how far we'd both come, how much we'd both grown. It wasn't about romance. It was about two people who'd survived something painful together and come out stronger. That connection had helped us both, and we both knew it. As my business grew, I started meeting new people, people with fresh perspectives, people who'd been through their own struggles and come out wiser for it. I wasn't looking for a relationship, wasn't searching for anything beyond the connections I was building. But I realized that if one day I met someone I could trust, someone genuine and honest, I'd be ready. I no longer saw love as some magical cure-all. It was something you built, something that only worked when both people were willing to invest in it. Maybe I'd find that someday, or maybe I wouldn't. Either way, I was content with who I'd become. The more time passed, the more I saw how much I'd grown. My days weren't defined by Lacey's choices or my pain anymore. They were defined by my own drive, my own decisions, my own hard work. Each day was a step further from the man I'd been, and closer to the person I wanted to be. By the time my business hit its first big milestone, I felt more at peace than I had in years. I'd gone from a man weighed down by betrayal to someone who could look in the mirror and feel a quiet pride. I was no longer tied to the choices of others, no longer burdened by a past I couldn't change. Instead, I was building something meaningful for myself, a life where I could feel grounded, where I could trust myself again. In the end, I didn't need Lacey or anyone else to define me. I was enough, And as I walked forward, I knew I'd never allow myself to settle for anything less than the truth, to live in anything less than honesty. The freedom wasn't in being single. It was in knowing that I could shape my own life, in finding the strength to stand alone. This was my story now, a new beginning, one I'd built with my own hands, free from the shadows of a broken past.